Pacific Ocean, 1943. A vast blue battlefield stretched thousands of miles between two powerful nations locked in the deadliest conflict the world had ever seen. High above the islands, above the endless ocean waves, a new kind of war was being fought. Not with tanks, not with ships, but with machines built from steel, aluminum, and human ambition. For years, the Japanese Mitsubishi A6M0 had ruled the skies of the Pacific. To American pilots, the Zero was almost a myth. It was incredibly fast. It could turn tighter than almost any fighter in the world. It climbed quickly. It had a legendary range. And most importantly, it was controlled by some of the most experienced pilots Japan had ever produced. At the beginning of the war, American pilots quickly learned a painful lesson. A dogfight with a Zero was not a normal fight. It was a fight against a machine designed around one idea: never let the enemy escape. The Zero was lightweight, extremely maneuverable, and deadly in the hands of skilled pilots. Japanese aviators became confident. Some believed American fighters were too heavy, too slow, and too complicated. They believed American engineering focused on strength instead of skill. And when a new American aircraft appeared in the Pacific skies, many Japanese pilots looked at it and laughed. The aircraft was bigger, heavier, less elegant. It did not look like the perfect fighter. It looked like a flying tank. The Americans called it the F6F Hellcat. And Japan was about to discover that sometimes the biggest threat is the one you underestimate. The Hellcat was created because America needed an answer. A machine that could survive. A machine that could fight. A machine that could finally defeat the Zero. The story of the Hellcat was not just about an airplane. It was about adaptation, technology, and the moment when the balance of power in the Pacific changed forever. When the first Hellcats entered combat, Japanese pilots saw something familiar. Another American fighter. Another large aircraft. Another target. They believed the same tactics that worked before would work again. But they were wrong. Because hidden inside the massive body of the Hellcat was a completely different philosophy of air combat. America had learned from every battle, every mistake, every lost pilot, every aircraft destroyed. The lessons were written in fire. And the result was a fighter designed not only to win battles, but to dominate the sky. The Zero was built around agility. The Hellcat was built around survival and power. The Zero could turn inside the Hellcat, but the Hellcat could take punishment the Zero could never survive. The Zero was a skilled fighter. The Hellcat was a weapon of industrial power. And when these two aircraft finally met above the Pacific, history changed. The pilots who once laughed at the American machine would soon find themselves fighting for survival. Because the Hellcat was not just another fighter. It was the beginning of the end of Japan's control of the skies. Chapter 2. The Creation of America's Answer. After the attack on Pearl Harbor, the United States entered World War II with one goal: build faster, build stronger, build enough. The early months of the Pacific War were a nightmare for American forces. Japanese aircraft dominated many battles. The Zero had gained a reputation as an unbeatable fighter. But American engineers studied every encounter. They discovered the truth. The Zero was powerful because it had incredible maneuverability. But that ability came with a weakness. To make the aircraft lightweight, Japan sacrificed protection. The Zero had limited armor. The fuel tanks were vulnerable. The aircraft could not absorb heavy damage. America decided to build something completely different. Instead of creating a smaller and lighter aircraft to compete with the Zero, American engineers created a fighter that could survive attacks and deliver overwhelming force. The result was the Grumman F6F Hellcat. Designed by the legendary aircraft company Grumman, the Hellcat was massive compared to the Zero. Its wings were larger. Its engine was more powerful. Its structure was stronger. The aircraft carried the famous Pratt & Whitney R2800 double Wasp engine, a powerhouse capable of producing around 2,000 horsepower. This engine gave the Hellcat incredible speed and climbing ability. But the real advantage was not just speed. It was confidence. An American pilot flying the Hellcat knew something important. If a mistake happened, the aircraft might survive. The pilot might survive. And survival meant another chance. The cockpit was protected. The fuel tanks were designed with safety in mind. The aircraft could absorb damage that would destroy many other fighters. American designers understood something Japan did not expect. A war is not won only by creating the most beautiful machine. It is won by creating the machine that keeps fighting. The Hellcat represented the American approach to war. Reliability, production, strength, and overwhelming numbers. While Japan struggled to replace experienced pilots and produce enough aircraft, America's factories produced Hellcats at an incredible speed. The aircraft became a symbol of American industrial power. But before it became a legend, it had to prove itself. And that moment came in the skies over the Pacific. Chapter 3. When the Hellcat entered the hunt. The Pacific battlefield was changing. American forces were moving forward. Island by island. Battle by battle. And above those islands, a new hunter appeared. The F6F Hellcat. Japanese pilots who saw the aircraft for the first time did not immediately fear it. They noticed the size. They noticed the weight. They believed it was another American mistake. A machine too large to compete. But the first encounters changed their opinion. The Hellcat was faster. It climbed better. It carried more powerful weapons. And unlike the Zero, it could survive a fight. American pilots quickly learned new tactics. They stopped trying to fight the Zero in its own game. They did not attempt endless turning battles. Instead, they used energy tactics. Speed. Altitude. Power. The Hellcat pilots attacked from above. They struck quickly. Then they escaped before the Zero could respond. The Japanese pilots had mastered close-range maneuvering. But the Hellcat forced them into a different kind of battle. A battle they were not prepared for. The Zero was like a knife. The Hellcat was like a hammer. And in the hands of skilled pilots, the hammer could break the knife. One of the most important moments came during the Battle of the Philippine Sea in 1944. The battle became known as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. American Hellcats destroyed hundreds of Japanese aircraft. The skies were filled with aircraft battles. But the outcome was clear. The age of Japanese air superiority was ending. The Zero was no longer the unstoppable force it once appeared to be. The Hellcat had arrived. And it had changed everything. Chapter 4. The Battle That Broke Japan's Sky. The summer of 1944. The Pacific Ocean became the stage for one of the largest air battles in history. The United States Navy was moving closer to Japan's home islands, and standing in the way was the remaining strength of the Imperial Japanese Navy. Japan still had experienced pilots. It still had thousands of aircraft, and many believed the Zero could still defeat American fighters. But the battlefield had changed. The Japanese pilots who once dominated the skies were now facing a completely different enemy. The F6F Hellcat. American pilots entered combat with confidence. Not because the enemy was weak, but because they finally had the aircraft they needed. The Hellcat gave them advantages that changed the rules of air combat. It could dive faster. It could climb faster. It could absorb damage. And it carried 6.50 caliber machine guns that delivered devastating firepower. A short burst from a Hellcat could tear apart an enemy aircraft. The Zero, meanwhile, remained fragile. Its design was still based on the idea that avoiding hits was better than surviving them. But against the Hellcat, avoiding hits became almost impossible. The American fighter was faster. The American pilots were better trained. And America had more of them. During the Battle of the Philippine Sea, Japanese aircraft launched massive attacks against the American fleet. Hundreds of planes flew toward the American carriers. But waiting for them were waves of Hellcats. The result was catastrophic for Japan. American pilots destroyed aircraft after aircraft. Japanese formations collapsed. Experienced pilots were lost. The battle became a symbol of a changing war. The Zero was no longer the hunter. It had become the hunted. For Japanese pilots, this was a terrifying realization. The aircraft they once trusted was now facing a machine designed specifically to defeat it. The laughter disappeared. The confidence disappeared. And in its place came a new reality. America had built a fighter that Japan could not ignore. The Hellcat was not just winning battles. It was destroying the foundation of Japanese air power. Because every experienced pilot lost was almost impossible for Japan to replace. The war was becoming a battle of production and resources. And in that battle, America had an overwhelming advantage. Chapter 5. The Pilots Behind the Machines. Machines do not win wars alone. Behind every Hellcat was a pilot. A young man sitting inside a powerful aircraft, thousands of feet above the ocean, knowing that one mistake could be his last. Many American pilots were young. Some had only months of training before entering combat. But the Hellcat gave them something extremely valuable. A chance. The aircraft was forgiving. It allowed pilots to make mistakes and survive. It gave them confidence to push themselves. Japanese pilots often had years of experience before the war. Their training was intense. Their skills were exceptional. But as the war continued, Japan faced a serious problem. Experienced pilots were dying faster than new ones could be trained. The quality gap began to grow. American pilots received better training systems. They practiced realistic combat techniques. They learned from veterans. They studied enemy tactics. The Hellcat became a symbol of this new generation of American air power. It was not about one perfect pilot. It was about a complete system. Training, technology, production, teamwork. Every victory in the sky represented thousands of people on the ground. Engineers, factory workers, mechanics, designers. The people who built and maintained these aircraft were part of the fight. A Hellcat in the sky was the result of an entire nation working together. And that was something Japan could not match. Chapter 6. The Zero's Final Days. By 1945, the Pacific War had entered its final stage. Japan was desperate. Its aircraft production was struggling. Its pilots were increasingly inexperienced. And American aircraft continued to improve. The Hellcat remained one of the most feared fighters in the Pacific. It was used for air superiority missions, escort missions, ground attacks, and protecting American fleets. The aircraft that Japanese pilots once underestimated had become a symbol of American dominance. The Zero was still dangerous. A skilled pilot could still make it deadly. But the world around it had changed. The war was no longer about individual skill. It was about technology, resources, and adaptation. Japan had created an aircraft that dominated the early years of the war. But America created an aircraft designed for the long fight. The Hellcat represented the future. The Zero represented the past. The final battles of the Pacific showed the difference clearly. American fighters filled the skies. Japanese aircraft became fewer. And the once feared Zero could no longer control the battlefield. The aircraft that had shocked America in 1941 was now struggling against a new generation of fighters. The Hellcat had completed its mission. It had taken the sky back. Chapter 7. The Legacy of the Hellcat. After World War II ended, the F6F Hellcat became one of the most successful naval fighters in history. It achieved an incredible combat record. It destroyed thousands of enemy aircraft. And it helped secure American control of the Pacific skies. But the story of the Hellcat is about more than statistics. It is about a lesson in war and innovation. The Japanese Zero was an incredible aircraft. It represented years of engineering and pilot skill. It earned its reputation through real victories. But every weapon has weaknesses. And every advantage can disappear when the enemy adapts. The Hellcat proved that. It showed that power, protection, and preparation could defeat even the most feared opponent. The pilots who once laughed at the aircraft eventually respected it. Because they understood what the Hellcat truly represented. Not just an airplane, but a turning point. A moment when the balance of power shifted forever. High above the Pacific Ocean, two fighters met. One built for agility. One built for survival. One from the early victories of Japan. One from the industrial strength of America. And when they finally collided in the skies, the world discovered that the Zero could be defeated. The F6F Hellcat did not just win dogfights. It changed history. Because sometimes the aircraft that looks too big, too heavy, too different, is exactly the machine that changes the course of a war. Chapter 8. The industrial giant behind the Hellcat. The story of the F6F Hellcat was never only about the aircraft. It was about the nation that created it. By 1943, the United States had transformed its entire economy into a machine built for war. Factories that once produced cars, machines, and everyday products were now producing weapons of unprecedented scale. Every aircraft represented thousands of hours of human effort. Every engine required precision. Every piece of armor required engineering. Every bullet loaded into a Hellcat's guns represented a massive supply chain stretching across America. This was the hidden power behind the fighter. Japan had talented engineers. Japan had skilled pilots. Japan had produced some of the finest aircraft of the early war. But America had something different. Capacity. The ability to build more. Replace faster. And improve constantly. The Hellcat became a symbol of that advantage. While Japan struggled with shortages of materials and trained personnel, American factories continued producing aircraft at a remarkable pace. The war in the Pacific became a battle between two philosophies. Japan focused on creating elite machines operated by elite pilots. America focused on creating powerful machines that could be produced, maintained, and flown by thousands. The Zero represented perfection through skill. The Hellcat represented victory through preparation. And history showed which approach could survive a long war. Because wars are rarely decided by the first victory. They are decided by who can continue fighting after years of destruction. The Hellcat was built for that reality. Chapter 9. The Men Who Flew into the Storm. Every Hellcat mission began with a moment of silence. A pilot sitting inside the cockpit, hands on the controls, engine roaring, thousands of pounds of machinery waiting to launch into the unknown. For these pilots, the sky was not just a battlefield. It was a place where seconds decided life or death. A Japanese Zero appearing behind them, a warning light flashing, a formation breaking apart, a sudden attack from above. Combat was chaos. But the Hellcat gave American pilots a powerful advantage. Trust. They trusted their aircraft. They knew it could take damage. They knew it could bring them home. Many pilots described the Hellcat as a fighter that felt strong and dependable. It was not the smallest. It was not the most elegant. But it was built like a warrior. American pilots developed tactics that used the aircraft's strengths. They attacked with speed. They controlled the altitude. They avoided turning battles where the Zero had an advantage. They fought smart. The goal was not to prove who was the better pilot. The goal was to win. And the Hellcat allowed them to do exactly that. The aircraft became a partner. A machine that carried them into the most dangerous skies on Earth. Chapter 10. Why the Zero lost its advantage. The Mitsubishi Zero was not a bad aircraft. This is one of the biggest misunderstandings about World War II aviation. The Zero was an extraordinary design for its time. When it first appeared, it shocked enemy pilots. It could travel long distances. It could turn incredibly tightly. It gave Japan a major advantage during the early years of the Pacific War. But the problem was not that the Zero was poorly designed. The problem was that the world changed. Aircraft technology moved forward. Tactics changed. And America adapted. The Zero's greatest strength became its greatest weakness. Its lightweight design made it agile. But it also made it vulnerable. As aircraft became faster and more powerful, the Zero struggled to keep up. The Hellcat exposed those weaknesses. A Zero pilot needed skill and precision. A Hellcat pilot had technology and strength. The difference became impossible to ignore. By the final years of the war, the Zero was fighting against an opponent that had learned its secrets. The Americans knew how to fight it. They knew its weaknesses. They knew how to survive against it. And once an enemy understands your weapon, the advantage begins to disappear. Chapter 11. The Final Showdown in the Pacific Skies. The final months of World War II were a completely different world from 1941. At the beginning of the war, Japan had shocked the United States. The Zero had dominated. Japanese pilots had confidence. The Pacific belonged to them. But by 1945, American aircraft controlled the skies. Hellcats flew over enemy territory. They protected fleets. They attacked targets. They became one of the most recognizable symbols of American air power. The aircraft that was once mocked was now feared. Japanese pilots who entered combat against Hellcats knew they were facing a serious opponent. The days of easy victories were gone. The Pacific sky had changed forever. The Zero had written the opening chapters of Japan's air dominance. But the Hellcat wrote the ending. It was not a single battle that changed everything. It was thousands of encounters. Thousands of decisions. Thousands of moments where American pilots and their machines proved their advantage. The Hellcat became the aircraft that pushed Japan backward. Chapter 12. The Machine That Changed History. Today, decades later, the F6F Hellcat remains one of the most respected fighters of World War II. It stands as a reminder of how quickly technology can change warfare. The Zero showed the world the importance of speed and maneuverability. The Hellcat showed the importance of strength, innovation, and adaptation. Both aircraft were incredible achievements. Both represented the nations that created them. But only one could dominate the final years of the Pacific War. The Hellcat was not created because America had the perfect answer from the beginning. It was created because America learned. It studied. It improved. And it refused to accept defeat. The Japanese pilots who once laughed at the massive American fighter eventually faced a harsh reality. The aircraft they underestimated had become the aircraft hunting them. The F6F Hellcat was proof that victory does not always belong to the weapon that looks perfect. Sometimes victory belongs to the weapon that can survive, adapt, and keep fighting. Above the Pacific Ocean, the era of the Zero ended. And the roar of the Hellcat announced a new chapter in aviation history. Chapter 13. The Last Flight of the Hellcat. When the guns finally became silent and the Second World War came to an end, the skies over the Pacific were no longer filled with the sounds of desperate battles. The aircraft that had once fought for survival became symbols of history. The F6F Hellcat had completed its mission. It entered the war when America needed a solution. It faced an enemy that seemed unbeatable. And it helped change the direction of one of the greatest conflicts in human history. The Hellcat was not famous because it was the fastest fighter ever built. It was not famous because it had the most advanced technology of its time. It became legendary because it did exactly what it was designed to do. It won. It protected its pilots. And it gave America control of the skies. The story of the Hellcat was a story of adaptation. At the beginning of the Pacific War, Japan had the advantage. The Zero was feared around the world. American pilots had to learn quickly or pay the price. But instead of copying Japan's approach, America created something different. Something stronger. Something built for the future. The Hellcat proved that a war is not only won by the first strike. It is won by the ability to learn from mistakes and create something better. The pilots who once looked at the Hellcat and laughed eventually understood what they were facing. A machine built with one purpose. To take back the sky. And it did. The Pacific skies that were once controlled by the Zero became dominated by the Hellcat. The balance of power shifted. The fear changed sides. And history remembered the aircraft that turned the tide. Today, when people look back at World War II aviation, they remember famous battles, legendary pilots, and incredible machines. They remember the Zero. But they also remember the aircraft that stopped it. The F6F Hellcat. A fighter that proved appearances could be deceiving. A fighter that looked too big, too heavy, too different. But behind that powerful frame was an aircraft that represented American determination. An aircraft that carried thousands of pilots into battle. An aircraft that helped bring victory closer. Because in war, the winner is not always the one with the most beautiful weapon. The winner is the one that can adapt faster. The one that can endure longer. The one that keeps flying when the enemy believes it has already won. And high above the Pacific Ocean, where the greatest aerial battles of the 20th century were fought, one aircraft changed everything. The Japanese pilots laughed at the F6F Hellcat. Until it swept their Zeros from the sky.